I'm going to be doing a trestle style base for the table, as you can see in that little diagram there. The final design and dimensions are still a bit fluid because I basically have to design the base around the timber that I have. It's all going to be more reclaimed Oregon. The foot of this base piece here and these posts, they're going to be out of 4 by 5 inch. That's the rough dimensions of the timber that I have. So they're quite chunky. These are those 4 by 5s that I mentioned before that I'd like to make the feet and the posts out of. So I have a few of those. Yeah, should have enough to do what I want to do with that. The stretcher in the middle is going to be, at the moment, it's going to be 3 lengths. So I think that's about 70 by 50 timbers. So I'm going to probably laminate 3 of them together to make that stretcher. I've got quite a bit of this timber and some good lengths of it, so I'm going to try and use it as much as I can. So that stretcher will be made out of those. These are the lengths of that 50 by 70 that I said I had quite a few of. And if you can have a look down that, they look pretty good too. They're nice and straight, so they should come up okay being dressed. I started off by cutting these pieces down to size just so that they would fit into the sawmill jig. But before I could put them into the jig, I had to take out the center adjusting rod. I chose to use the router with the sawmill jig to dress these pieces because I was just really impressed with the result I got when I used this method for the lengths of timber for the tabletop. Once I'd flattened one edge of these posts, I just then flipped the piece 90 degrees, lined up that routed face with the side panel of the jig, and then dressed the next edge 90 degrees, which was 90 degrees to that first one, and did that for all 4 edges, and then just did that 6 times. Next was to cut down some of these lengths of the 70 by 50 for the center stretcher beam, so just cut them to length as well. And then once confirming that the factory edge on this board was dead straight, I attached these pieces of rough sawn timber to that board, and that gave me a straight edge that I could use to run through the table saw. And what that allowed me to do was get one true flat surface on the rough sawn timber, and then after doing that I just attached that flat surface back onto the board, ran it through the table saw again, and that gave me a second edge that was true and flat, 90 degrees to the first one, and then after I'd done that I could then run them straight through the table saw and use those flat surfaces as references. Before I laminate this stretcher beam together, I just want to check that I'm happy with the proportions, how it'll look in the legs. So I've done a mock-up of one of the legs at the end. That piece of timber across the top there with the 2 clamps, that's the top of that timber is the top of the table. And the posts are as they are. So I'm just thinking whether that stretcher beam is too high. In my mind I think it is, but if I were to take one out and leave it at 2, I probably wouldn't be happy with that either. I think that would be too narrow, so I'm going to make a compromise and do 2.5. So I'm going to cut one of those in half. One of these beams, after I dressed it, I noticed it had a little bit of rot in the beam, and you can see it just there. It's a bit flaky, and I probably wouldn't be happy with leaving that in. Probably cut this one down to get rid of that rot, leaving about half, maybe a little bit more than half of that, and then that stretcher will end up at 2.5 of those wide, and yeah, I think I'll probably be really happy with that. After drilling through the first length and countersinking the holes, I then just sat it on top of the second board that I was going to attach to and drilled through those holes just so I could get a reference for the holes on the second piece. Drilled a pilot hole and then just glued and laminated it together. While I'm waiting for these two pieces to glue up, I've just gone ahead and drilled some holes in the last piece there. As you can see, I've offset the screw holes. So on the end there, you can see they're offset, and then every hole after that is placed halfway between where the screw holes are on the piece that it's going to attach to. And this piece here, this is going to be the underneath of the beam facing the ground, so you're not going to see that anyway. And what I'm doing, I need to countersink those holes. So what I've done is I've just set up my drill with a block on it like that, and I'm going to drill them by hand, because as there's a hole in there already, the bigger drill will just follow that pilot hole, so no chance of it really going off skew. So again, once I've drilled those holes in that last piece, I laid it on top of where it was going to get screwed to, drilled through those holes just to give me a mark underneath, and that allowed me to drill the pilot holes. And then again, just glued and laminated together. And once the beam had dried, I just squared off the ends using my hand power saw and this really simple guide to make your cuts very easy and accurate, and then rounded off all the edges with 1/4 inch round over bit in my trim router. Okay, so now that I've finished this beam, I can concentrate on putting the legs together. I needed to finish the beam to get that final width, so I could use that measurement for the gap between the two uprights on the leg. So the way it's going to work, this is a foot piece. There's going to be two uprights next to each other like that, obviously centered on that foot piece. And this gap here is going to be the right size gap to take this beam. Now I'm going to join the uprights to the foot using mortise and tenon joints. The tenons I'm going to cut on the table saw, and the mortise I'm going to cut using the router. I'm going to cut the tenons on the table saw using this really simple jig. I just knocked this up in a couple of minutes, so I didn't bother videoing it because it is very, very simple. But what I will point out is the important aspects of it is nice flat piece here that sits nice and flat on the table saw. These support pieces here, I ensured that they were cut at perfect right angles, which hopefully made this face here end up at perfect right angles to the table. This is the important face because that's where the piece is going to bolt to. And if you have a look at that, that's perfectly square there, so that's good. This piece here, that's the stopper for putting your workpiece against. It's also very important that that stopper is perfectly 90 degrees to the table this way. This particular one is just guided on my existing table saw fence with this piece here that goes over it. There are other ways of making them adjustable. Like I said, I just had to make a really simple one because I wanted to get it done quickly. And the way I'm going to measure it out, the cheeks of the tenons, or the cheeks that I'm going to cut off the tenons, are going to be 20 millimeters. So I just set this face here to 20 millimeters to the outside edge of the blade and set the fence. And then when I run it through, all the cheeks that come off will be the same size. To start off making the mortises, I took out the bulk of material using Forcenet bits. I've just made a negative of the tenon that I just cut on the posts, and I'm going to use that as a template to cut the mortise with the router. So it's just got a couple of rails there that align it on the piece, and just whack in a nail to hold it in place so it doesn't slide along. Just make sure I'm happy with that. It's in the perfect spot. I'm just eyeing it off, but just want to make sure it's right. And I just whack a nail in there. These end pieces are going to have a chamfer cut on them, so I'm not too worried about that nail hole there. I just take off the template now and set the router a bit deeper, and I can use that what's already cut out there as the guide to cut the rest. I want to go as deep as my router bit will let me, which works out about 60 millimeters, I think. I've finished routing out the mortise now. I haven't squared off the corners. What I've done is I've taken the easy way out, or the lazy way if you want to call it that. I'm comfortable with that description. Instead, I've rounded off my tenon. So we'll see how it fits. Yeah, that's a nice tight fit. Lines up beautifully. That's pretty much perfect. Yep, couldn't ask for better than that. To give these foot pieces a more pleasing look, I cut 60-degree chamfers on each end. I wanted to create a pad on the end of each foot piece to help the table sit more level, and the idea was that that cutout was going to have curved or radius corners. But I made the mistake of taking the piece too far forward or too far along on the table saw and ended up cutting right into the corner. So to get rid of that mistake, I had to actually square off the corners, as you can see there with the table saw, and then just finish it off with the router. Next job was to start dressing some more lengths of that 50 by 70 stock to make the upper cross supports for the legs. So I used the same method of screwing them to a board and dressing them and facing them off, and then after finding out the smallest dimension, I ran them all through the table saw and cut them all to the same size. Just squared off the ends, and then again cut a 60-degree chamfer on each corner, just so it matches the foot piece, and just to ease off those corners as well. Once I had the final width of those top braces, then I could set my table saw to the right height and cut out these sections on the leg pieces where those top braces were going to actually sit, end up sitting flush with the edge of the leg. To help the beam sit in between the two leg pieces, I cut out a large section, but very shallow. It's only about 5mm deep, that section there. First of all with the table saw to get right into the corners, and then finished it off with the router. After all that cutting and milling and rebating I've been doing on these leg pieces, I've finally had the opportunity to put them together in a mock-up, just to see that they all fit together nicely and that there's no issues. Check the fitment and the alignment, and I've got to say it all looks just fantastic. These angles, if you can see there, these angles are just perfect right angles. That one there and that one there, looking great. The distance the distances between this top rail and this foot and the bottom of this foot here, it's the same distance on both sides. So that's all looking square and straight. Got the stretcher beam there in the middle. The next thing to do is to bolt this stretcher beam to these two uprights. Now that's going to be one long bolt through all of that. They're going to be recessed inside the legs a short distance, and then those holes will be plugged with some dowel. Also going to fix this top support rail to the tops of those uprights. Yeah, really happy with how it's coming together. My initial thoughts were to drill through the of these two posts and the stretcher beam all in one hit when it was assembled together, just using an extra long drill bit. But then I thought to myself, trying to drill over that distance, which is roughly 220 and 260 millimeters, the chances of drifting is almost certain, and I didn't want that. So what I thought is I'll do it in pieces. So I made up a very, very simple jig here, and all that does is keep my drill bit straight and at right angles this way and that way. I'm going to drill through the first piece, drill through the second piece in exactly the same spot, and then assemble the posts and the stretcher beam together, and then I only have to use the holes that I've already got just to drill through the beam. After drilling through the first upright, I laid it on top of the corresponding upright for that same leg and just drilled through the holes to make a mark. That way I know they would line up perfectly. With the uprights and the stretcher beam now bolted together, it was time to permanently fix the cross support brace. So I just countersunk some holes with a brad point bit and then drilled a clearance hole only through the leg piece, and in the cross brace piece I drilled some pilot holes and then glued and screwed it together. You would have noticed I was keeping the glue low or below the top of these posts. I'm going to knock off about an inch off the top of both of those posts just with my handsaw and a guide. That'll be pretty easy to do. The reason for that is the underside of the table now is going to have a brace under it, and that brace is going to fit hard up against the back of this. So that's why I'm going to take the top of those off. These feet aren't fixed yet. They've just got to be glued in place, and whack a few screws in from underneath just to pull the whole thing together, make it a bit stronger. These threaded rods were only temporarily in place, holding the table leg together. Now it was time to countersink them into the leg and cut them to length so that they fit into those holes, and later on those holes will be plugged with some dowel.